Number 1. Basic concepts under the 1987 Constitution. Letter A. Declaration of Principles and State Policies. That the Philippines is a democratic and republican state. Republican state means that it is a state in which supreme power is held by the people and their elected representatives. The supremacy of civilian authority over the military, people's duty to defend the state, separation of church and state, renunciation of war as an instrument of national policy, and other policies such as the promotion of an independent foreign policy, the recognition of the youth and women's role in nation building, and the promotion of a comprehensive rural development and agrarian reform. So letter B is about national territory. The national territory comprises the Philippine archipelago with all the islands and waters embraced therein, and all other territories over which the Philippines has sovereignty or jurisdiction, consisting of its terrestrial, fluvial, and aerial domains, including its territorial sea, the seabed, the subsoil, the insular shelves, and other submarine areas, the waters around, between, and connecting the islands of the archipelago, regardless of their breadth and dimensions, form part of the internal waters of the Philippines. Letter C. Separation of powers. The Philippine government takes place in an organized framework of a presidential, representative, and democratic republic whereby the president is both the head of state and the head of government. This system revolves around three separate and sovereign yet interdependent branches: the legislative branch, which is the lawmaking body, the executive branch, which is the law enforcing body, and the judicial branch, which is the law interpreting body. Executive power is exercised by the government under the leadership of the president. Legislative power is vested in both the government and the two-chamber Congress, the Senate, which is the upper chamber, and the House of the Representatives, which is the lower chamber. Judicial power is vested in the courts, with the Supreme Court of the Philippines as the highest judicial body. So we talked about letter C, about separation of powers. So there are three branches. First is the executive branch. Under the Constitution, the Philippine Constitution, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Philippines, selected by popular vote to a term of 6 years. The President may no longer run for re-election unless he or she becomes President through constitutional succession and has served for no more than 4 years as President. The Vice President is the first in line to succession should the President resign, be impeached, or die in office. The Vice President usually, though not always, may be a member of the President's cabinet. If there is a vacancy in the position of the Vice President, the President will appoint any member of the Congress, usually a party member, as new Vice President. The appointment will be validated by a 3/4 vote of Congress voting separately. A 3/4 vote of Congress voting separately. So the Senate will vote, kailangan mo doon yung 3/4, and the Congress, the lower house, will vote, kailangan mo doon yung 3/4 nila. Then let's go to the legislative branch. The district and sectoral representatives are elected with a term of 3 years. Sectoral representatives are those that receive 2% to 6% of the national vote in total. Both the district, yan yung mga alam nating congressmen, and sectoral representatives are elected with a term of 3 years. They can be re-elected, but they are no longer eligible to run for a 4th consecutive term. The House of Representatives may opt to pass a resolution for a vacancy of a legislative seat that will pave way for a special election, the winner of which will serve the unfinished term of the previous district representative. And the third branch, which is the judiciary branch, under the Philippine Constitution, it shall be headed by the Chief Justice and 14 associate justices, all appointed by the President on the recommendation of the Judicial and Bar Council. And then under the judiciary branch are the lower collegiate courts, which includes the Court of Appeals, Court of Tax Appeals, the Sandigan Bayan. The regular courts shall be under the judiciary branch. Ito yung regional trial court, metropolitan trial court, municipal trial court, municipal trial court in metropolitan trial court in cities, and municipal circuit trial courts. Tsaka yung Muslim courts, yung Sharia district courts, and the Sharia circuit courts. What is the doctrine of checks and balances? The Philippines is a republic with a presidential form of government wherein power is equally divided among its three branches. Yun nga yung executive, legislative, and the judiciary. One basic corollary in a presidential system of government is the principle of separation of powers, wherein legislation belongs to Congress, the execution to the executive, and settlement of legal controversies to the judiciary. What is the doctrine of state immunity? State immunity The basic concept of state immunity is that no state may be subjected to the jurisdiction of another state without its consent. So the state may not be sued without its consent. State immunity is a concept in international law that aims to protect the sovereignty of a state by placing it outside the jurisdiction of other states. This immunity protects the state from prosecution in foreign courts as well as against enforcement measures on its assets and property. Under the jurisprudence, yung case na US versus Ruiz and US versus Ginto, it was stated that a foreign state cannot invoke immunity from suit if it enters into a commercial contract. The Philippines adheres to restrictive sovereign immunity. So sabi rin sa state immunity, when the government expropriates property for public use without paying just compensation, it cannot invoke its immunity from the suit. Otherwise, the right guaranteed in the Constitution that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation will be rendered nugatory. Sabi rin about state immunity pa rin tayo, Section 7 of Act Number 3083 prohibits execution upon the government. In a Supreme Court decision, it was held that even if the government may be sued, it does not follow that its properties may be seized under execution. Ito yung mga walang pondo, kinasuhan ng gobyerno, pero hindi naman pwedeng i-execute, pinoprohibit yung pag-execute ng property ng gobyerno. So letter D, pag-usapan natin checks and balances as a general rule. Separation of powers, yun ang general rule. Ang exception nun ay yung blending of powers and checks and balances. So yun yung exceptions ng separation of powers. Blending of powers. Constitutional entities blend powers when they put their powers together to achieve a goal. When the president signs a bill, there is blending of powers between the executive and the legislative branch. When the president vetoes, there is checks and balances. When the Commission on Appointments confirms the president's appointment, there is blending of powers. When it does not confirm, there is checks and balances. Checks and balances occur between and among the three great branches of the government and other constitutional bodies. From the moment a law is created and becomes effective, the president has power to implement, and Congress cannot interfere. The exception is that Congress has the oversight powers through number 1, questions hour, and number 2, power of inquiry. Letter E ng basic concepts under 1987 Constitution, state immunity. State immunity is a principle of international law that is often relied on by states to claim that a particular court or tribunal does not have jurisdiction over it or to prevent enforcement of an award or judgment against any of its assets. Under the jurisprudence, when the government expropriates property for public use without just compensation, it cannot invoke its immunity from the suit. That right is guaranteed under the Philippine Constitution that private property shall not be taken for public use without just compensation. Letter F, under pa rin tayo ng mga basic concepts pa rin to. The delegation of powers. So under the Philippine Constitution, the people delegated the legislative power to the Congress. The legislative powers shall be vested in the Congress of the Philippines. The delegation of power entails a surrender of authority to representatives, or in the case of legislative power, to the Congress. Thus, lawmaking can only be performed by the Congress even if the law it enacts involves the people. Non-delegation of powers. Sinasabi sa non-delegation of powers, the rule states that what has been delegated cannot further be delegated. Potestas delegata non delegari potest. The delegated power must be discharged directly by the delegate and not through the delegate's agent. It is basically an ethical principle which requires direct performance by the delegate of an entrusted power. Further delegation therefore constitutes violation of the trust reposed by the delegator on the delegate. Ano na may mga exceptions ng non-delegation of powers? Meron siyang 5 exception. Number 1, delegation of tariff powers to the President under the Constitution kasi yan. Number 2, delegation of emergency powers to the President. Kailan mo pwedeng i-delegate ang emergency powers to the President? If there must be a war or other, kailangan merong war or other national emergency. Number 2, the delegation must be for a limited period only. Number 3, the delegation must be subject to such restrictions as the Congress may prescribe. And number 4, the emergency powers must be exercised to carry out a national policy declared by the Congress. So pwede nating sabihin, yung sa COVID, yan, yung emergency powers ng President. O number 3, ikatatlong exception, delegation to the people at large. So the Congress further delegates its legislative power by allowing direct legislation by the people in cases of initiative and referendum. Ika-4 na exception, delegation to local governments. This delegation is based on the principle that the local government is in better position than the national government to act on purely local concerns. Legislative power is therefore given to them for effective local legislation. And number 5, delegation to administrative bodies. The Congress delegates the power of subordinate legislation. Ulitin natin, the Congress delegates the power of subordinate legislation to administrative bodies. Due to the growing complexity of modern society, it has become necessary to allow specialized administrative bodies to promulgate supplementary rules so that they can deal with technical problems with more expertise. Regulations or supplementary rules passed by the administrative bodies are intended to fill in the gaps and provide details to what is otherwise a broad statute passed by Congress. So yun ang exceptions sa non-delegation of powers. Ano naman ang completeness test? Ideally, the law must be complete in all its essential terms and conditions when it leaves the legislative, so that there will be nothing left for the delegate to do when it reaches him except enforce it. So ulitin natin the completeness test. Ideally, the law must be complete in all its essential terms and conditions when it leaves the legislative, so that there will be nothing left for the delegate to do when it reaches him except enforce it. Kasi yun naman ang trabaho ng administrative agencies, to enforce. What is the sufficient standard test? Ito laging ginagamit to ng nag-a-adhere ang Korte Suprema sa sufficient standard test. It is intended to map out the boundaries of the delegate's authority by defining the legislative policy and indicating the circumstances under which it is to be pursued and effected. The purpose of the sufficient standard is to prevent a total transference of legislative power from the lawmaking body to the delegate. So kailangan suriin. Hindi kasi total, hindi inherent sa dun sa pinagpasahan ng kapangyarihan. Yung dapat subject yun sa limits ng legislative branch. And letter G, under the basic concepts ng 1987 Constitution, letter G, fundamental powers of the state. Ito yung mga inherent and do not need to be expressly conferred by the constitutional provision on the state. Okay? They are supposed to coexist with the state the moment the state comes to being. It is deemed invested with these three powers as its innate attributes. Ito yung police power, power of eminent domain, and the power of taxation. Police power is the power of the state to regulate liberty and property for the promotion of the general welfare. So it is the power of the state to regulate liberty and property for the promotion of the general welfare. Yan ang police power. Power of eminent domain enables the state to forcibly acquire private property upon payment of just compensation for some intended public use. So kailangan for public use and upon payment of just compensation. Power of taxation. The state is able to demand from the members of society their proportionate share or contribution in the maintenance of the government. So anong kaibahan ng tatlong fundamental powers of the state? Police power regulates both liberty and property. Power of eminent domain affects property rights. The power of taxation affects property rights as well. Police power may be exercised only by the government. Power of eminent domain may be exercised by private entities. Pinapayagan sila para silang nanghihiram ng kapangyarihan sa national government. Ito yung mga nag-expropriate. And the power of taxation may be exercised only by the government. Ano yung similarities nila? Pare-pareho silang fundamental powers, so they are inherent in the state and may be exercised by it without need of express constitutional right. They are necessary and indispensable. The state cannot continue without them. They are methods by which the state interferes with private rights. They all presuppose an equivalent compensation for the private rights interfered with. And ikalima, they are exercised merely by the legislative. Yun yung pare-pareho sila. And since nabanggit natin yung power of taxation as one of the fundamental powers, magpunta tayo sa part 2, yung general principles of taxation. So taxation is inherent in sovereignty. Isa yan sa mga nature ng taxation, inherent siya sa sovereignty. It is legislative in character and subject to constitutional and inherent limitations. Scope and limitations of taxation: number 1, compulsory; number 2, comprehensive; number 3, involuntary. Under the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court held that the power to impose taxes is one so unlimited in force and so searching in extent. It is subject only to restrictions which rest on the discretion of the authority exercising it. It is comprehensive because it covers all persons, activities, businesses, professions, rights, and privileges. It is unlimited because the only limitation is the responsibility of the legislature which imposes tax to the constituents who pay it. It is plenary because it is not incomplete. The government may avail of valid remedies to make sure that tax is collected. It is supreme because whatever subject may be selected to pay the tax. Okay, the limitations on the power of taxation. Punta muna tayo sa inherent limitations. So these are limitations or restrictions that spring from its very own power. While the power of taxation is inherent in sovereignty, there are also limitations or safeguards which spring from its own inherent power. Number 1, limitation on public purpose. So it is an essential characteristic of the power of taxation that the tax is imposed for public governmental purpose. Number 2, limitation on territorial jurisdiction. The power of taxation is limited only within the boundary or territory of the state. Exception ay yung personal jurisdiction. Before, OFW are taxed. Now they are exempted sa kita nila sa labas. Number 3, non-delegation of legislative power of taxation. Number 4, international committee. The state could not tax another sovereign under the principles of international law to which we adhere. And number 5, exemption of government agency. Self-imposed practical limitation that the government does not tax itself. Government exercising governmental or sovereign functions is not taxed. But when government agency exercises proprietary function, taxation is the rule. So binubuwisan sila kapag the government agency exercises proprietary function. At ito naman yung constitutional limitations. Number 1, the requirement of due process. So when the state exercises the power of taxation, the taking of the property should be subject to due process. Number 2, equal protection of laws under the Constitution. Number 3, uniformity and equity in taxation. Ito yung ability to pay. Under the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court held that equality and uniformity in taxation means that all taxable articles or kinds of property in the same class shall be taxed at the same rate. The taxing power has the authority to make reasonable and natural classifications for purposes of taxation. Number 4, sa constitutional limitations ay yung rule on progressive taxation. This is a directive to Congress. Hindi naman siya judicially enforceable rights. So, direktiba lang siya ng Constitution sa Kongreso na kung maaari, progressive ang system ng taxation. Number 5, prohibition against impairment of obligations and contracts. Taxing power cannot alter or revoke existing rights and obligations under valid contracts. When a taxpayer enjoys a contractual tax exemption, then it is protected by the non-impairment clause. Number 6, prohibition against imprisonment for non-payment of poll tax. Number 7, non-impairment of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to review final decisions on tax matters. Number 8, the free exercise of religious profession and worship is superior to the power of taxation. Hindi mo pwedeng buwisan yon pagka ang isang lugar, for example, ay ginagamit sa religious worship. Number 9, no public money or property shall be appropriated for the use of religious purposes. Number 10, exemption from real property taxation on properties which are used for religious, charitable, and educational purposes. Ito yung sinabi ko kanina. Number 11, exemption of non-stock, non-profit educational institutions. Non-stock, non-profit educational institutions. Number 12, ratification requirement on tax exemptions. Ito, para magkaroon ng tax exemption, it requires the concurrence of the majority of the members of Congress. Kailangan majority of the members of Congress. Hindi yung majority constituting a quorum. Kailangan majority of the members of Congress to grant tax exemptions. Number 13, tax measures and tariff bills shall originate in the House of Representatives. So pag tax measures and tariff bills, dapat magsisimula siya sa House of Representatives, hindi sa Senate. Pero ang sabi niya, a revenue measure on its own cannot proceed at the instance of the Senate. Yan sinasabi ko nga, without a corresponding version from the House. Number 14, tax money collected for a special purpose shall be treated as a special fund. Yan. Yun yung mga constitutional limitations. Ano ang ibig sabihin ng situs of taxation? It means the place of taxation. What is territoriality principle? So, as a rule, the power of tax is limited to the state's territory because as an inherent power of sovereignty, it follows the rule that sovereignty extends not beyond the sovereign's territorial limits. So, yun ang territoriality principle. Punta tayo sa letter D ng General Principles of Taxation. Requisites of a valid tax. Number 1, the tax must be for public purpose. Yeah. Number 2, the rule of taxation should be uniform. Number 3, the person or property taxed is within the jurisdiction of the taxing authority. Number 4, the assessment and collection should be in harmony with the due process clause. And number 5, the tax must not infringe on the inherent and constitutional limitations of the power of taxation. Letter E, tax as distinguished from other exactions. So it is important to differentiate taxes from other exactions, especially when it comes to problems and issues on double taxation and other exemptions. So ito, to identify its limitations, i-compare natin yung tax with other exactions. So yung tax is an all-embracing term to include various kinds of enforced contributions upon persons for the attainment of public purposes. So in comparison to tariff is a kind of tax imposed on articles which are traded internationally, exported from or imported to a country. So traded internationally. Customs duties naman are actually taxes, but the latter is broader in scope. So yung comparison ng tax doon kay tariff and custom duties. Ang tax is paid for the support of the government. It is a demand of sovereignty. No limit as long as it is not excessive, unreasonable, or confiscatory. And it can only be imposed by the government. Ang toll naman, toll is paid for the use of another's property. Demand for proprietorship. The amount paid depends upon the cost of construction or maintenance of the public improvement used. Pwede siguro natin maisip yung NLEX. Yan. Imposed by a government or by private individuals or entities. So siguro yung mga expressway siguro pag-aari ng NLEX. Ganyan. So ang tax, pag sa tax, failure to pay does not make the act or business illegal. penalty for non-payment ay surcharges or imprisonment maliban sa poll tax. So, failure to pay ng tax does not make your act or business illegal at ang penalty mo for non-payment ay surcharges or imprisonment maliban na lang kapag poll tax kasi nakalagay sa Constitution na bawal kang makulong sa non-payment ng poll tax. In comparison with license and regulatory fee taxes, ito yung levied under the police power of the state. It is exacted to regulate certain businesses or occupations. Amount should not unreasonably exceed the expenses of issuing the license and of supervision. It is imposed only on the right to exercise a privilege. Failure to pay license and regulatory fees makes the act or business illegal. So pag hindi ka nakabayad ng tax, di naman ibig sabihin illegal yung negosyo mo. Pero pag hindi ka nakabayad ng license and regulatory fees, nagiging illegal ang iyong business. Ang tax is levied not only on land, so it is imposed regardless of public improvements. Contribution of a taxpayer for the support of the government. General application both as to time and place. Yun ang tax. In comparison naman sa special assessment, a special assessment is levied only on land. It is imposed because of an increase in value of land benefited by public improvement. Special assessment is a contribution of a person for the construction of a public improvement. It is exceptional both as to time and locality. Ang tax, based on laws yan. Generally cannot be assigned, generally paid in money, cannot be subject of set-off or compensation, di ba pwedeng i-set-off. Imprisonment is a sanction for non-payment of tax, maliban na nga lang sa poll tax, and does not draw interest. Ang debt naman, o ang utang, it is based on contract, it is assignable, may be paid in kind, can be subject of set-off or compensation. So, a person cannot be imprisoned, yun, pareho sila. Hindi ka naman pwedeng makulong kapag poll tax ang hindi mo nabayaran. Draws interest when stipulated. Ang utang, pwedeng mag-interest. Ang tax, hindi naman. So, ang tax, violation of tax laws may give rise to imposition of penalty. Generally intended to raise revenue, may be imposed only by the government and cannot be subject of compensation or set-off. Ang penalty naman, under the Civil Code, yan, it is any sanction imposed as punishment for violation of the law or acts deemed injurious. Penalties are designed to regulate conduct. Penalties may be imposed by government or private entities, and penalties can be subject of set-off or compensation. Okay, so kinds of taxes. Merong dalawang iba't ibang kinds as to whatever. So, two types of taxes muna tayo in the Philippines according to taxing authority. So, national taxes refer to mandatory contributions under the National Internal Revenue Code. Ito yung estate tax, documentary stamp tax, percentage tax, capital gains tax, income tax, withholding tax, value added tax, excise tax, and donors tax. Yan yung mga nakapaloob sa National Internal Revenue Code. Ang local taxes naman are imposed by the local government of an area under the local government code. So ito yung franchise tax, basic real property tax, sand, gravel, and other quarry resources tax, business of printing and publication tax, annual fixed tax for delivery trucks and vans, professional tax, amusement tax, community tax o yung cedula, barangay tax, and the barangay clearance. So as to the nature of tax, merong direct at indirect taxes. So direct taxes are one type of taxes an individual pays that are paid straight or directly to the government. Such taxes are computed based on the ability of the taxpayer to pay, which means that the higher their capability of paying is, the higher their taxes are. So ang uri ng direct tax ay income tax, and pag mas malaki ang income mo, mas malaki ang binabayaran mong buwis. Transfer taxes, entitlement tax, property tax, capital gains tax, corporate tax. So ang direct taxes ay based on individual earnings. Mas malaki ang kinikita mo, mas malaki ang babayaran mong buwis. Ang indirect taxes naman are taxes that can be passed on to another entity or individual. They are usually imposed on a manufacturer or supplier who then passes on the tax to the consumer. The most common is the excise tax on cigarettes and alcohol, tsaka VAT. So mga indirect taxes, sales tax, di ba pag namili tayo sa fast food may nakalagay 12%, ganyan. Excise tax, customs tax, gas tax, value added tax, at service tax. Indirect taxes do not look at individuals' ability to pay but are the same for everyone who buys the goods. It is imposed on goods that consumers buy. So isa-isahin lang natin yung mga taxes sa Pilipinas. Yan, nabanggit na natin pero bigyan lang natin definition yung mga common. Capital gains tax is a tax imposed on the gains presumed to have been realized by the seller from a sale, exchange, or other disposition of capital assets located in the Philippines, including pacted de retro sales and other forms of conditional sale in the Philippines. Documentary stamp tax is a tax on documents, instruments, loan agreements, and papers pertaining to the acceptance, assignment, sale, or transfer of an obligation, rights, or property incident thereto in the Philippines. Di ba yung mga nagbabar exam, nire-require ng documentary stamp tax. So yun. Philippine Donors Tax is a tax on donation or gift and is imposed on the gratuitous transfer of property between two or more persons who are leaving the Philippines at the time of transfer. Income tax is all tax on all annual profits arising from property, profession, trades, or offices, or a tax on a person's income, emoluments, profits, and the like in the Philippines. Percentage tax is a business tax imposed on persons or entities who sell or lease goods, properties, or services in the course of trade or business whose gross annual sales or receipts do not exceed 3 million and are not VAT registered in the Philippines. Ulitin nga natin, percentage tax is a business tax imposed on persons or entities who sell or lease goods, properties, or services in the course of trade or business whose annual gross receipts do not exceed 3 million. So may paupahan ka, hindi lumalagpas ng 3 million ang iyong gross annual sales or receipts at hindi ka VAT registered in the Philippines, magbabayad ka ng percentage tax. Pero kung naaalala ko yung tinuro ni Ma'am Lim, kapag lumagpas ka na ng 3 million na annual sales or receipts, ikaw ay obligadong magpa-VAT registered. Tama pa ba yung alaala kong yun? Value-added tax is a business tax imposed and collected from the seller or vendor of services in the course of trade or business on every importation, sale of properties, ito yung real or personal properties, or lease of goods and other properties. It is an indirect tax, thus it can be passed on to the buyer in the Philippines. Withholding tax and compensation is the final tax withheld from individuals receiving compensation income in the Philippines. It is the employer's responsibility to withhold and pay these taxes on a monthly basis. Expanded withholding tax is a kind of withholding tax which is prescribed only for certain payers and is creditable against the income tax due of the payee for the taxable year. Income tax withheld constitutes the full and final payment of the income tax due from the payee on the said income in the Philippines. Philippine withholding tax on government money payments. Withholding tax on government money payments is the withholding tax withheld by government offices and instrumentalities including GOCCs and LGUs before making any payments to private individuals, corporations, partnerships, and or associations in the Philippines. Basically, ang pagkaintindi ko sa withholding tax, ito yung sumweldo ka tapos yung withholding agent mo. Yun na yun. Magbabayad siya sa national government. Okay, so letter G, doctrines in taxation. So the lifeblood theory. Under the lifeblood doctrine, taxation is indispensable to the existence of government such that the government needs the contribution of its citizens in order to function and operate. Ano naman yung construction and interpretation of tax laws, rules, and regulations? So under the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court held that in every case of doubt, tax statutes are construed strictly against the government and liberally in favor of the taxpayer, whereas tax exemptions are construed strictly against the taxpayer and liberally in favor of the government. Prospectivity of tax laws. This principle states that the tax bill must only be applicable and operative after becoming a law. Thus, the effectivity of the law commences upon its approval and its scope would only cover the present and future transactions. Imprescriptibility of taxes. Under this principle, taxes will not prescribe against the government because of the principle that taxes are lifeblood of the government and their prompt and certain availability is an imperious need. Double taxation. Under the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court held that there is double taxation when the same taxpayer is taxed twice by the same taxing authority for the same purpose within the same jurisdiction during the same tax period, and the taxes are of the same kind or character. At all events, there is no constitutional prohibition against double taxation in the Philippines. It is something not favored but is permissive, provided some other constitutional requirement is not thereby violated, such as the requirement that taxes must be uniform. Exemption from taxation. So a tax exemption is strictly construed against the taxpayer. It is a derogation from the lifeblood doctrine. As a result of this, it cannot be liberally construed in favor of the taxpayer. Taxation is the general rule and the exemption is the exception. Number 7, escape from taxation. It means to get free of tax, to avoid taxation, to be missed from being taxed, or to be forgotten for tax purposes. So ano ba ito mga to? Shifting. The original payer or one whom the tax was assessed transfers the burden of tax to someone else. Capitalization. So the total amount of future tax is expected to be paid for the object is deducted from the purchase of the object. It occurs if property is income generating. Transformation. The seller maintains his selling price and margin of profit not by shifting the tax to his customers but by improving his method of production. The savings he acquires from reduced production cost is used to cover the amount of tax. Mahilig ako rito, transformation, titipid. Tapos yung savings ko ron, yun ang binabayad. Evasion. The use of illegal and fraudulent means to escape or lessen the payment of tax only occurs on the amount not paid. So ang evasion, masama ito. It is a crime. Avoidance. The use of tax-saving devices or means sanctioned by law to avoid or reduce the tax liability. It would involve the use of alternative tax rates or methods of tax assessment provided by law. So tax evasion is a crime, tax avoidance is not. And exemption. So the government grants immunity to particular persons or corporations or a particular class of persons or nature of business. It is a privilege without which they would be taxed like others similarly situated. Kaya nga daw ang exemption pag ginrant yan, it should be construed in favor of the government. Not in favor, kasi nga, binabawas mo yan doon sa print lifeblood doctrine eh. So, yun. So, para makatakas kasi taxation, merong shifting, capitalization, transformation, avoidance, and exemption. Tax evasion is a crime. Ano pa ibang doktrina rito? Equitable recoupment. So under this doctrine, a taxpayer is allowed to raise a time-barred claim of tax overpayment as an offset to reduce or eliminate the amount owed on the BIR's timely claim. So hindi naman daw pwedeng i-offset ang tax, pero under equitable recoupment, yung claim mo ng overpayment, pwede mong gamitin yun para to reduce or eliminate the amount owed on the BIR's timely claim. Meron din namang prohibition on compensation and set-off yan. Under this principle and the jurisprudence, the Supreme Court held that a taxpayer may not offset taxes due from the claims he may have against the government. Taxes cannot be the subject of compensation because the government and taxpayer are not mutually creditors and debtors of each other, and a claim for taxes is not such a debt, demand, contract, or judgment as is allowed to be set off. So hindi mo siya pwedeng i-set off. Pwede mo lang siyang may overpayment ka, ibabawas yun sa susunod na payment. Pero hindi mo siya pwedeng i-set off. Okay. So natapos na natin yung taxation. May mga singit lang na isingit dito yung line of succession, no? So under the Constitution, succession to ng office. Punta muna tayo sa Vice President, President, yung mga ganyan. So in case the President of the Philippines is not able to discharge the duties of his office due to death, disability, or resignation, so kapag namatay si President, susunod si Vice President. In case naman na namatay si President, in case of death, in case of death, disability, or resignation of both the President and Vice President, the Senate President. In case of death, disability, etc. of the Vice President, the President, the Vice President, and the Senate President, Speaker of the House of Representatives. Okay? So the Congress of the Philippines is mandated to enact a law calling for a special election 3 days after the vacancy in the office of the President and Vice President. So pag dalawa silang nawala, nategi sila, the Congress of the Philippines is mandated to enact a law calling for a special election 3 days after the vacancy in the office of the President and Vice President. This special election should occur 40 days after the enactment of the law, but not later than 60 days after the enactment of the law. So ang tinutukoy dito sabay na vacancy. Nawala si President and Vice President. Kasi pag ang na-vacate si Vice, nandiyan si President, pero na-vacate si Vice, kukuha nabasa natin kanina, mag-a-appoint si President. Mag-a-appoint si President ng kanyang preferably malamang kapartido niya kapag nawala si VP from the Congress. So line of succession under the Constitution at pag VP, ito, the President of the Philippines is required to nominate a replacement with the concurrence of the Committee on Appointments. So line of succession, nawala si President, si VP. Wala si President at si VP, magkakaroon daw ng special election. The Congress is mandated to enact a law calling for